I am Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, United States Department of Defense." "Oh, right, and I'm the Queen of England." Karen Wilburn burst into laughter, as if she'd just heard a cheap joke from some nobody. Her voice was sharp like a razor blade, her eyes flashing with scorn under the scorching Georgia sun. In front of her stood a black man in handcuffs, his clothes dusty and worn. In her mind, not a person, just an old black man who needed to be put in his place, a perfect target to flaunt her hollow authority. She didn't bother looking at the badge, didn't need to verify his identity, because to her, skin color was already a sentence. But that day, Karen wasn't just wrong. She pulled the pin on the grenade buried under her own career. Carlton didn't get angry, didn't shout. He simply pulled out his phone like a man commanding the storm from the eye of the hurricane. "Connect me to the Pentagon." 3 black SUVs came tearing across the horizon like missiles fired from the heavens. No sirens, no plates, no warnings. Just pure authority stepping out in deadly silence. Men in black suits, sunglasses, eyes cold as steel. No words, no explanations. One look was enough to make the entire system turn on its heels. Karen froze like stone, face pale. That smug smile vanished as if it had never existed. Her throat tightened. And in that moment, she didn't just get the wrong man. She had thrown her entire career straight into the teeth of justice. Which state are you living in? Has your state ever witnessed a system crumble over just one contemptuous glance? Leave a comment. I want to hear your story. Late in the afternoon, the sun cast long beams of light through the pine trees lining the road. From Fort Benning, General Carlton Hayes cruised smoothly along Highway 280, a road he had grown familiar with over years of service. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and scorched grass, saturating the air with the essence of a southern Georgia summer. He wore simple civilian clothes, a dark-colored polo shirt and neatly pressed slacks. His military jacket, adorned with medals and the insignia of a 3-star general, was neatly folded on the back seat, a silent emblem of the true man behind the wheel. No one needed to remind him of the importance of maintaining a modest appearance. When he wore that uniform, he represented the strength and honor of an entire force. But when he wasn't in uniform, he was just a lone black man on these desolate stretches of road, a reality he never allowed himself to forget. The GPS screen in front of him flickered oddly. A software glitch caused the navigation system to lose its way, jumping chaotically between unrecognized locations. Carlton frowned slightly, scanning for a safe place to pull over. Ahead, a patch of open ground spread out beside the road, next to an old weather-worn sign that read, "Ellaville, 4 miles. He signaled and gently steered the vehicle to the shoulder, the tires crunching lightly over the gravel. The engine continued to hum steadily in idlement. Outside, the scene was so quiet it felt almost frozen. No traffic, no voices, only the wind rustling through dry branches and the sunlight fading behind a line of low hills. Carlton retrieved his military-issued phone from the side compartment, his fingers moving swiftly as he tried to recalibrate the system. The screen trembled, displaying distorted coordinates. He exhaled slowly, his eyes maintaining their sharp, cold focus. On the surface, it was simply a man pulled over to check his GPS in the countryside. But inside, 3 decades of military instinct were silently sweeping the surroundings, mapping exit routes, noting suspicious objects, registering every faint sound in the air. No threat appeared, yet Carlton knew absolute stillness was sometimes the first sign of trouble, and so, without showing it, he stayed ready, like a soldier crossing a battlefield that had yet to reveal itself. The Georgia sky began to change color. The deep blue gave way to the pale purple of twilight, gently draping the still pine trees like aged sentinels. A few wispy silver clouds drifted slowly over the distant hilltops, tinged with a scorched orange hue by the setting sun. The surrounding air was eerily quiet. No voices, no engines, only the persistent rasp of cicadas, echoing like a lament from the dry earth. An empty asphalt road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, cutting through the desolate forest. On its cracked, sun-baked surface, heat still rose in invisible waves, making the softened patches of tar shimmer as if they were moving under the fading light. A black sedan sat idling by the roadside, its engine humming steadily, a low, deliberate breath like that of a large beast resting but not yet asleep. Inside the car, Carlton D. Hayes sat motionless, his back relaxed against the seat, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. He wore a white, long-sleeved shirt, the collar unbuttoned at the top, no tie. His face was composed, cheekbones etched gently by the sunset glow, his dark, weathered skin betraying his age but still carrying the hardened edge of a man shaped by war. On the GPS screen in front of him, the map flickered erratically, as if lost. The weak signal lacked enough data to determine his current location. A narrow road intersected the main highway, unnamed, with no lights or signs. Carlton frowned slightly. A dead zone. He glanced around. Only pine trees and a chilling emptiness. Then, suddenly, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. A small, unfamiliar movement. Strange, unsettling. A dot in the orange-streaked sky grew larger. Not the wind, not an animal crossing. It was the nose of a police cruiser, slowly approaching. Carlton didn't move, but his heart shifted from ease to alertness. The old cruiser rolled forward deliberately, almost noiselessly, save for the faint crunch of tires on the hot asphalt. The shape was unmistakable. A square, battered body with faded paint like the hide of a scarred animal. The words Schley County Sheriff barely clung to the side, just a smear of silver letters, like memories blurred in an old case file. The roof lights blinked red and blue, but strangely, there was no siren. Carlton narrowed his eyes, his hands tightened slightly on the wheel. Not enough to show tension, but enough to be ready. No action, no overreaction, just readiness. The cruiser eased up behind him, then slowly swung to the left side of his car, like a predator circling, gauging distance, position, and possible escape routes before striking. Then it stopped, taking up nearly all of the shoulder. A deliberate kind of parking, blocking, crowding, cutting off sight lines and options. The driver's door creaked open with a sharp screech. The person who stepped out was a woman, but there was nothing soft or indistinct about her silhouette. She was tall, broad-shouldered, as solid as a concrete post embedded in scorched ground. Her pale blonde hair was neatly tied beneath her police cap. The twilight gleamed off her oversized sunglasses, reflecting back a light as cold as steel. She needed no introduction, no name tag. Just one glance, one stride, one presence, and Carlton already understood. This was not a cop on a routine patrol. Karen Wilburn. That name would eventually make its way into a report, on the news, or in a hearing if things went south. But for now, it wasn't necessary. Carlton didn't need a name to recognize the type of person standing before him. 30 years in the military had taught him to read people in seconds. That stance, those eyes, that overconfidence, it all spoke louder than words. It told him everything. Karen walked briskly toward the black sedan without government plates. She offered no greeting, no introduction, and performed none of the standard safety checks expected of a traffic officer. Each step she took on the gravel ground landed like a threat, pounding into the thick air of the late forest afternoon. When she was less than 2 meters from the car, Karen suddenly activated the entire warning light system. The headlights flared, turn signals blinked, and the roof lights flashed in rapid succession, a chaotic mix of red and blue flares, like an oppressive stage set up in the middle of nowhere. But Carlton didn't move. He kept both hands clearly on the steering wheel, his expression calm, the look of someone who knows that any movement could be misinterpreted, intentionally or otherwise. Karen stood squarely at the driver's side window, feet planted wide, right hand resting loosely on the grip of her gun. Her stance wasn't cautious. It was a show of dominance, a display of raw power. She leaned in, her sunglasses reflecting Carlton's eyes like a black mirror. Without waiting for him to speak or explaining her purpose, Karen tapped firmly 3 times on the window. Knock, knock, knock. Neither fast nor slow, Carlton lowered the window halfway, just enough to speak, but not enough to allow an easy reach-in or surprise move. Karen's voice cut through, dry, cold, and completely devoid of basic servility. "What are you doing here?" Carlton replied with a warm, steady tone like the current of a military-grade power grid. "I just stopped to check the navigation system. No intention of violating anything, officer." A textbook answer, measured and cautious. But Karen had no interest in listening. Her eyes scanned the vehicle's cabin quickly, searching as if trying to confirm something already decided. Then her gaze locked. On the back seat lay a neatly folded military jacket, adorned with a row of medals and 3 gleaming silver stars. Clear signs of a high-ranking general. Anyone with the slightest knowledge of the military would recognize it. But Karen's expression didn't shift. If anything, it hardened, not because she didn't understand, but because she refused to. Because Carlton was a black man, in a place she believed he didn't belong, and that alone was enough to turn suspicion into accusation. Without another word, Karen stepped back half a pace, her hand sliding along her belt, passing the radio, pausing at the gun holster. Carlton saw it all. Every gesture, every movement, every measured breath of the woman in front of him, all of it deeply familiar. In 30 years of military service, he had seen that look many times. The look of someone not seeking truth, but confirmation of their bias. And he knew full well, for people like Karen Wilburn, the badge on their chest wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a license to abuse power, as long as the target didn't look enough like a rightful citizen. Karen leaned closer to the window, her voice snapping like a whip. "Where's your paperwork? License? Hand it over, now." Carlton gave a slight nod, still calm. "I will if permitted. My license and federal ID are in the glove compartment." A completely safe and cooperative response. But Karen wasn't interested. She squinted, lips curling into a sneer. "Of course. You people always have a good reason." And as if to further assert control, she activated another level of emergency lights. The red and blue flashes thickened across the pavement, reflecting in the rearview mirror, casting half of Carlton's face in oppressive hues. Not the color of caution, but of threat. Nothing in Karen's conduct resembled a lawful stop anymore. She wasn't seeking answers. She had already issued a verdict in her mind, and in that verdict, Carlton didn't deserve to be heard, didn't need evidence beyond the color of his skin, and his presence in the wrong place, as she saw it. She had made her decision. Carlton was a problem to be dealt with. No further reason needed. No more proof required. Carlton remained still, his face composed, but deep inside, every muscle tensed, ready, not to resist, but to prepare for another kind of battle, one without weapons, without fists, but requiring more resolve than any confrontation on the battlefield. The red and blue lights from the police car continued flashing relentlessly, casting fiery streaks across the black body of Carlton's car like a silent accusation. The air between the two grew thick, taut, like a bowstring ready to snap. Karen stood there, right next to Carlton's window, with the posture of someone who wasn't there to communicate, but to dominate. She didn't bend down as one usually would to reduce the distance. On the contrary, she kept her back straight, looking down at him, as if her height somehow gave her more authority. After a few seconds of heavy silence, Karen tilted her head slightly, her cold sunglasses reflecting Carlton's eyes. "I'll ask you again. What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't loud but sharp enough to cut into the skin. No, sir. No minimal courtesy between a citizen and an officer of the law. Only the familiar tone of someone used to going unchallenged. Carlton remained still, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. His voice was steady, like that of a man who had endured hundreds of far greater pressure situations. "I pulled over to check my GPS. It seems the navigation system is malfunctioning." Karen leaned in slightly, her eyes quickly scanning the interior of the car. Then she stopped for several long seconds when she saw the neatly folded jacket on the back seat. its bright three-point star insignia catching the flashing lights. To someone knowledgeable, a single glance would be enough to recognize it as the jacket of a lieutenant general. But Karen's gaze wasn't seeking the truth. Instead of stopping to inquire further, she frowned. It wasn't a frown of doubt about the facts, but one of irritation, as if Carlton was challenging the assumptions she had already made the moment she saw the car and the color of its driver's skin. "This your car?" she asked. Carlton gave a slight nod. "Yes, all paperwork is in order, and I'm ready to present it upon formal request." Karen snorted. She didn't ask. She didn't want to hear it. She just stood there silently for a few more seconds, as if waiting for Carlton to slip up. But Carlton remained still, sitting upright, his gaze unwavering. A gentle breeze passed through, tossing a few dry strands of grass nearby. But in that scene, the coldest thing wasn't the wind, it was Karen's eyes. Not because they were sharp like steel, but because they weren't searching for justice. They were merely seeking confirmation of what she had already decided, that this black man must be trouble. Karen stood there, unmoving, her icy eyes locked onto Carlton. She didn't ask further questions, didn't make any reasonable requests for verification. Instead, she stared at him with the look of someone who had already made up their mind, as if he was a criminal to be dealt with immediately. Her first real words came like a punch. "Don't get smart with me," she said, her voice hard as stone, no room for nuance. "I don't need explanations from you." She smirked, smugly, a condescending grin. That wasn't a request, it was a command. Karen didn't allow Carlton any chance to justify himself, not even a second to explain why he had stopped there. Everything had already been decided in her mind. Carlton remained motionless, his demeanor unchanged. But inside, the tension started to mount. This was no longer a routine check. This wasn't about paperwork or simple inquiry. This was a test of power. Karen wasn't finished. She pressed on. "When you ask, you answer." Her voice now carried no patience. It lashed out like a whip, striking at the pride of anyone who dared oppose her. She didn't want the truth. She only wanted the answers she had already decided upon. Her words, seemingly casual but dripping with menace, tightened the noose around Carlton. The questions weren't genuine. They were just a tool for her to assert dominance over the situation. "Who do you think you are?" she barked, not needing a response. "What right do you think you have here?" Each word cut into Carlton's side, but he didn't flinch. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside his mind, the scene played on an endless loop. Karen's tone grew more disdainful with every second, her voice intruding into every gap of silence Carlton tried to maintain. She didn't allow him to speak. She wasn't waiting for any reasonable answer. Meanwhile, bystanders started to take notice. A few people had stopped at a distance, standing at the edge of the scene, observing. Their expressions carried a mix of unease and suspicion. They said nothing, only watched carefully. But Karen didn't care about the eyes upon her. She pushed forward, intent on establishing dominance right then and there. She stepped closer, one hand near her gun, the other pointing at Carlton. "You have no right to argue with me. Hands on the hood." The next command came with absolutely no room for mercy. Among the small crowd, some phones were raised, starting to record video. But Karen didn't seem to notice. She wanted to impose her authority immediately, publicly, without interference. Carlton felt the stark difference between a routine stop and a conviction without a court. This wasn't justice. These weren't legitimate questions. This was a blatant abuse of power, without cause, without procedure. Every move Karen made seemed calculated to corner him, to drag him into a world where he had no right to speak. The tension continued to escalate, but Carlton maintained his composure. In Karen's eyes, he was nothing but a black man without rights, but in his own, this was the moment to demonstrate true dignity, not through words, but through action. He didn't move. He didn't falter. He simply sat there, staring back at Karen with eyes that held not a trace of fear. Night was beginning to fall, the outside world growing gloomier as tree shadows stretched long across the pavement like silent phantoms. The old police cruiser was parked beside Carlton's sedan, its red and blue lights flashing relentlessly, a signal that tension was escalating. Karen stood next to her vehicle, one hand firmly on her gun's grip, her eyes never leaving Carlton. She wasn't a cautious officer who would carefully assess each move. She had made up her mind the very moment she saw him, and now she wasn't about to allow any resistance. In her mind, Carlton had no right to explain or argue about the situation. Step out of the vehicle, place your hands on the hood now. Karen's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. Her command wasn't a request, it was an imposition of authority. She didn't care about checking the reason for the stop or listening to any explanation from Carlton. She simply wanted to see this man obey her orders, and she wouldn't tolerate any form of defiance. Carlton didn't move immediately. He remained seated, both hands on the steering wheel, his face calm, showing no sign of worry or tension. Years in the military had taught him how to handle the most stressful situations without letting emotions take over. He knew that every move he made would determine the outcome. Resisting or showing anger would only worsen things. Despite recognizing Karen's abuse of power, Carlton stayed calm, neither challenging nor resisting. He knew that any sudden movement could trigger a stronger reaction from her. He didn't want the situation to escalate. So, he slowly opened the door, keeping his hands visible, and stepped out. Karen still didn't move closer. She maintained her distance, her eyes locked onto him. As an officer, facing this civilian felt different. This wasn't a normal situation. She saw in his eyes a patience she had never encountered before. His calmness felt like a challenge, as if he knew he wasn't the one in the wrong, and that unsettled her, shaking the foundations of her belief in her own authority. I said, "Hands on the hood. Don't make me say it again." Karen's voice sharpened, growing harsher, but Carlton remained unchanged, standing tall, composed, not rushing to comply. His gaze was steady, unflinching. Karen sensed the subtle defiance, but she wasn't about to back down. "Enough. Either you cooperate, or I'll add resisting an officer to your charges." Still, Carlton didn't rush to the hood. Instead, he turned and looked at her, his gaze calm, yet piercing. He knew Karen was trying to maintain control, but he also knew her control was misplaced. This wasn't justice. It wasn't true power. It was a false authority built on domination without reason. Karen stood rigid, waiting for his reaction. Carlton, with the patience of a man who had fought on many battlefields, stood silently, not moving, not resisting, but not yielding either. A few heavy seconds passed, the air growing thicker. Karen said nothing more, but her eyes bore into him, trying to force Carlton into submission. She didn't want an explanation. She just wanted compliance, like a subject before a sovereign. But Carlton was not someone who could be oppressed. They could control his movements, but they could never control his dignity and resilience. Tension hovered heavily in the air, as if time itself had frozen. Karen continued to stare at Carlton, treating him as if he were already guilty, something she had the right to stop at any moment. She had no intention of backing off, showing no hesitation in her words or actions. Her gaze remained locked on him, waiting for him to move without question. Carlton, without hurrying, maintained his composure, recognizing that Karen's attitude had already crossed the bounds of a normal stop. His resolve was firm, and his patience was now his greatest weapon. He looked at Karen, exhaled a slow breath, weighing his options to de-escalate the situation without worsening it. "I am a federal officer," Carlton said slowly, his gaze steady. "My credentials are inside the vehicle." His voice was calm, free of fear or anxiety. He didn't need to raise his voice to assert himself. Announcing his status wasn't meant to intimidate. It was a reminder that this was not an ordinary situation. He carried the responsibility of a nation, yet his words drifted past Karen like the wind. Karen didn't react immediately. She merely gave a dismissive smirk, thinly veiling her contempt. Her eyes never left him. As soon as Carlton finished speaking, she brushed off his words as if they didn't exist. "Oh, really? And what do you expect me to do with that little title of yours?" Karen sneered. "All I need is for you to follow my orders." Her response carried no respect whatsoever for his identity. Even after he had stated he was a federal officer, she chose to ignore it. Determined to maintain her dominance, without regard for any law or justification. Her tone made it clear. In her eyes, his title meant nothing. This was clearly no routine stop. It was an assertion of raw power, a battle not against the law, but against the prejudice and pride Karen harbored within herself. Around them, the atmosphere grew heavier. A small crowd began to gather at a distance. Their curiosity piqued. Phones were raised, tiny screens catching the light, reflecting on anxious faces. Yet Karen paid no attention to the gathering onlookers. She was fixated on maintaining her control, determined to show her authority could not be challenged, even by a federal officer. Carlton noticed the growing crowd but remained unaffected. No rush, no panic. He understood what was happening and what would happen next. His focus was solely on preserving his dignity, refusing to be diminished by the oppression unfolding before him. With slow, deliberate movements, he opened his car door. It creaked slightly, and with measured steps, he stepped out of the sedan. Each step he took was a quiet affirmation of his strength, unwavering. Even faced with blatant abuse of authority, he gave no ground. The flashing lights reflected on his face, but Carlton's expression remained unchanged. He stood tall, moving neither quickly nor aggressively. In that moment, he didn't need to resist openly. His calmness was his true power, one that no one could strip away. He knew that sometimes doing nothing was the strongest act of resistance. Karen stood watching, displeased that he wasn't complying immediately. But Carlton did not waver. He moved forward slowly, unhurriedly, and as he did, Karen's sense of control began to erode. The gaze of the crowd shifted subtly, and within seconds she felt the first tremors of doubt gnaw at her arrogant certainty. Karen stood firmly in front of the car, her eyes never leaving Carlton. Her voice was cold, without a hint of sympathy or deference. Her words were not a polite request, but an undeniable order. "Open the bag and the car. I will search everything." Carlton heard every word clearly, and immediately recognized that this was not a routine police request. Karen provided no justification for her actions. She gave no legal basis, no reasonable cause to search his vehicle or person. This was simply an exertion of power, a clear abuse of authority. Karen's gaze remained unchanged, not suspicious but resolute. She looked at Carlton as if he were a criminal, and that searching him was nothing out of the ordinary. There was no discussion, no transparency in what she was doing. This was not a routine administrative check. It was personal coercion and oppression. Carlton, though maintaining his composure, felt the injustice unfolding before him. This was not a simple situation he could resolve with a few words. Karen's attitude reflected neither fairness nor the true purpose of law enforcement. She wasn't searching for safety. She was flexing her authority, demanding compliance without a legitimate reason. Throughout his years of military service, Carlton had faced countless challenging situations, but this time, what he confronted wasn't a standard inspection. It was a power struggle where the enforcer abused her authority. Despite recognizing the injustice, Carlton showed no signs of confusion. He stood firm, his eyes calm. Yet inside, he knew this was a critical turning point. If he complied without resistance, it would be an acknowledgement that Karen's power was absolute. If he resisted, he would immediately become the target of her authority. A minute passed in silence. He continued to impose without hesitation. "I said, open the bag and the car. You have no right to argue with me." Her words were hard as steel, filled with violence in their tone. She offered no opportunity for explanation, only demanding that he obey without a legitimate reason. She wanted to see him submit, to prove that in this situation, she held all the power. Everything became clear to Carlton. This was not a normal administrative check. This was an overt, blatant abuse of power. This was discrimination. A disregard not just for him, but for the very principle of justice a police officer was sworn to uphold. The crowd began to pay closer attention. From behind, curious glances started to gather. Some people stopped, silently observing. A phone was raised. The glow from the phone screens illuminated both Carlton and Karen, making the tension even more palpable. Karen, however, showed no intention of easing the pressure. She saw the growing crowd but displayed no hesitation or change in attitude. She continued demanding that Carlton comply with her orders, oblivious to the fact that people were watching. Carlton did not rush. He knew that his silence, his composure, was crucial. He could not allow himself to be dragged into the trap Karen had set. He would not let her strip him of his dignity, even under this kind of oppression. Films continued recording, flashes flickered from different angles, but Carlton remained unmoved. He stood his ground, not rushing, preserving his dignity, refusing to let Karen or anyone diminish his worth with this act of oppression. After being ordered to submit to a search without reasonable cause, Carlton remained calm, though the injustice grew more apparent than ever. The sense of oppression was not new to him, but this time it came from a police officer who held the authority to affect his life in that very moment. Yet Carlton refused to be driven by emotion. He knew that confronting this abuse of power could not be achieved through anger or strong resistance. He had to maintain his composure, something Karen would never expect. With a steady breath, Carlton spoke, his voice devoid of anger, carrying only a calm warning. "Officer, I understand what you are doing, but you are making a serious mistake. I am not resisting. I am only asking you to follow proper procedure. And I remind you that I am a federal officer. You have no lawful reason to search my car or my person." Carlton's voice was neither loud nor rushed. It was simply firm and composed, meant to make Karen realize that he was not someone who could be easily manipulated by unreasonable authority. His words, though gentle, carried immense weight. It was a clear reminder that abuse of power would not go unchallenged. Karen did not respond immediately. She looked at him, but not with thoughtfulness or understanding. Instead, her eyes were rigid and determined. Nothing had changed in her attitude. Carlton's warning did not reach her. It only made her more obstinate, more determined to control the situation on her terms. She had no intention of listening to explanations. She wanted only the answer she demanded. Every word Carlton spoke was treated as an obstacle, a challenge she needed to crush. "No matter what you say, I will proceed according to my process. Open the bag and the car immediately," Karen replied, her tone unchanged, utterly devoid of softness or understanding. She spoke as if it were natural, an unquestionable command. Her words were not merely authoritative, they were laced with contempt, as if she believed her power was untouchable. The crowd began to grow larger. Curious glances turned into decisive looks. More phones were raised. The clicking of cameras seemed to amplify every tense moment. People started to realize something was wrong. They didn't speak, but their eyes and actions said it all. They were watching and remembering. Karen, noticing the attention building, felt no urge to de-escalate. Instead, the crowd's presence seemed to embolden her. She did not seek explanations from Carlton. She sought to prove that in this situation, she alone commanded obedience. She wasn't just enforcing the law. She was asserting that no one could challenge her authority. Carlton sensed this, and as the crowd recorded the unfolding scene, he felt the tension thickening in the air. Yet, instead of reacting hastily, he calmly stepped away from the car. Without a word, without a sudden move, his calmness and resolve were evident in every motion. He was not afraid. He was not panicked, only steadfast. The red and blue lights kept spinning on the empty road, casting long shadows across the ground. The heat from the day seemed unabated, as if the air itself was rising with the suppressed heat accumulated over 1,000 years. Sounds battered Carlton's ears, yet he only heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the steady rhythm of his own breathing. No noise could break this silence, no sound except Karen's voice. Every word she uttered, every command she imposed, felt like a blow against his composure. But Carlton did not allow himself to be swept away by the rising emotions. He knew all too well that this was not a routine encounter. She wasn't merely enforcing the law. She was abusing her power without hesitation, behaving as if he was someone undeserving of fairness. Looking at Karen standing there, her hand still resting on her weapon, her voice sharp as a blade, everything about the situation indicated she had no intention of cooperating or following protocol. She only wanted to assert her dominance. Silence. Only the steady whir of the lights, the soft wind rustling the branches. But within Carlton, it felt as if something was about to break. And he knew. This was the moment he had to speak. He couldn't let this situation unfold the way Karen intended. He had to put an end to this oppression. So, Carlton spoke, his voice deep, steady, yet filled with patience. "I am Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, United States Department of Defense." His statement wasn't boastful or self-important. It was a declaration, an affirmation of identity, of the responsibility and authority he carried. Everything he had done, every action he took, was backed by reason and purpose. It was not just a title. It was a symbol of pride, of sacrifice, of the thousands who had once served under his leadership. His words drifted into the air, quietly, without any emotional eruption. Only certainty, steadiness, strength, and, most importantly, truth. He wasn't expecting leniency or change from Karen, but his words were a clear message about what he represented, and he would not let her or anyone else disregard it. Yet Karen's reaction didn't change. She straightened up, her eyes still glittering with disdain. She looked at him as if he had just uttered something absurd, something nonsensical. A mocking smile flickered at her lips, devoid of respect or fear. Only ridicule. "Lieutenant General," Karen sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I'm the Queen of England, right?" She said nothing more, just stood there, her eyes glinting with contempt, as if what Carlton had said held no value. She didn't believe him. She had no intention of verifying his identity, no interest in confirming who he was. His words to her were nothing but mockery, a flat-out rejection, as if a military officer's declaration wasn't even worth consideration. Karen stood firm, not backing down in the slightest. She wasn't just disregarding his rank. She was determined to prove that, in her eyes, it meant absolutely nothing. Her pride had never been clearer, nor her refusal to yield. Carlton could feel the injustice woven into every one of her words. But he didn't get angry. He knew that anger was the weak weapon she wanted him to wield. Instead, he maintained his calm, upholding his dignity. "You may not believe me," Carlton said, his tone still unwavering, "but I will not change. You are in the wrong, officer." His voice was calm, yet commanding. He did not threaten, he simply stated the truth. He wanted Karen to realize that not everything in life could be dismissed out of arrogance. Karen didn't reply. She just stared at him, and that made the lack of respect she harbored even more obvious. Her attitude wasn't a challenge to authority, it was outright contempt for who he was. The crowd around them grew larger. Curious gazes, smartphones raised and recording. Everything was becoming public. But Karen didn't ease the tension. She stood stiffly, her eyes showing no hesitation. Carlton remained upright, his gaze steady on her, without a trace of panic. He knew that in moments like this, composure was the strongest weapon, and he would not let Karen or anyone else overpower him. Karen offered no response to Carlton's words, no hint of reflection or consideration of what he had said. She didn't check his identity, didn't seek any evidence. Even though Carlton had declared himself a lieutenant general from the Pentagon, to Karen, his statement was meaningless. Instead, she simply scoffed again, her expression unchanged, as if she alone had the power to decide his fate right here, right now. Lieutenant General? Karen repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. Then I must be the Queen of England. She didn't need to ask further, didn't need to hear any more from him. To Karen, what he said had no value. She wasn't interested in investigating, wasn't concerned with verification, only in asserting control. Her words sliced through the air, severing any possibility of rational exchange, wrapping the atmosphere in a dense cloud of tension. She wasn't just mocking him, she was treating his very existence as an offense. In her eyes, Carlton's rank, service, and sacrifices meant nothing. Only her authority mattered. Carlton remained motionless, not reacting immediately. He clearly understood that this wasn't a routine administrative stop. This was a confrontation between power and dignity, and in this moment, he had to stand firm to protect his honor. But Karen wasn't finished. She stepped closer, intent on overwhelming him completely. Every step she took was full of arrogance, a certainty that she could do whatever she pleased with this man. She didn't care to consider his words, didn't bother to hear his warnings. To her, his statements were irrelevant. "Don't think you can teach me how to do my job," Karen said, her tone growing colder. "You'll follow my orders, now." This wasn't merely an order, it was a power play. She didn't just want him to comply. She wanted to see him submit. To Karen, control was the only thing that mattered. But Carlton didn't waver. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lose his temper. He simply maintained the composure that had been forged through years of military service. He wouldn't allow her to break him with her words. Inside, however, the contempt radiating from Karen felt like a slow-burning fire. This wasn't a battle of guns or weapons. It was a battle of pride, dignity, and justice. He couldn't allow Karen to continue demeaning him like this. But he also knew that any act of defiance would only escalate the danger. Still, the sense of oppression couldn't be ignored. He didn't want to inflame the situation, but neither could he stand idly by while Karen abused her power. The scorn in her gaze wasn't just disrespect. It was a threat to the very principles he had devoted his life to defend. The crowd around them grew more attentive. Phones were lifted higher, their screens reflecting light onto the faces of the two adversaries. But no one spoke, no one intervened. The entire area was cloaked in a heavy, suffocating tension. People watched, but no one dared to step forward to defend Carlton or to oppose Karen. Karen stood firm, unwavering. She continued to assert her dominance, unyielding, unflinching. Meanwhile, Carlton stood his ground, refusing to yield to her demands. He knew that in this moment he was not just defending himself, he was defending everything he represented. The red and blue warning lights continued flashing, but now they felt like an alarm not only for Carlton, but also for the people around. In the silent air, where only the sound of the light wind could be heard, Karen stepped closer. She no longer showed a hint of patience. Her demeanor had completely shifted, now reduced to sheer rudeness and oppressive authority. She stood straight in front of Carlton, reaching into his waistband to grab his wallet without a hint of hesitation or formality. She didn't ask, didn't request permission, didn't offer a single word of notice. She simply acted, yanking the wallet from his pocket as if it was something she had every right to seize whenever she pleased. Carlton didn't resist. He maintained his composure, keeping his emotions hidden, but a deep sense of injustice swelled inside him. This act was not just a violation of his privacy, but a blatant sign of disrespect. A police officer, entrusted to uphold the law, was behaving with brute force and utter disregard for dignity. Karen flipped through his wallet without any thorough examination. She barely skimmed through the contents, the ID card, credit cards, insurance cards, glancing at them carelessly without any real interest. Her eyes passed over the important documents that could have easily verified Carlton's identity. In that brief moment, Karen saw the Level 4 Pentagon access card in Carlton's wallet. That card, carrying high security clearance, should have prompted her to stop and verify, but instead Karen dismissed it, acting as if it meant nothing. The Pentagon card was no trivial matter. It was a clear indication that Carlton was a high-ranking military figure, yet Karen neither paused to confirm it nor showed any awareness of its significance. This only made one thing clearer. Karen had no interest in discovering the truth. She didn't want to know who he was. What she wanted was control, to assert her dominance, even if it meant abusing her power and violating someone's personal rights. Clear signs, like the Pentagon card, which could have confirmed every word Carlton said, were simply ignored. The injustice Carlton felt now came not only from being searched without legitimate cause, but from witnessing firsthand how an officer of the law could behave this way, without a shred of remorse. Karen wasn't merely disrespecting him, she was dismissing his entire identity, as if it held no value. The tension in the air thickened. Karen didn't notice the indignation in his eyes. She carried on with her actions, her face unchanged, showing no hint of regret for what she was doing. Her stance remained rigid, showing no sign of compromise or retreat. Carlton remained where he was, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his expression unchanged. He said nothing more, but deep inside, he knew this was not justice being served. This was pure oppression, and he would not allow himself to be broken by such blatant disrespect. Time seemed to slow down. The crowd standing farther away began to pay closer attention, some raising their phones, the glow of screens lighting up the dark. But Karen didn't notice the shift. She continued her stiff, aggressive conduct, oblivious to the rising discomfort in the atmosphere. Carlton realized that, even though he did not resist, his silence at this moment was his way of holding on to his dignity. The watching crowd and the recording phones brought a slight unease to Karen, but she carried on as if nothing had changed. In that instant, Carlton knew that any resistance would only make things worse. But he also understood that in this world, his calmness would be his strongest weapon against such abuse of power. Karen flipped through Carlton's wallet with unnecessary haste. Although her eyes passed over each document, credit card, ID, insurance card, when her hand brushed against a card marked with the unmistakable emblem of the Pentagon, everything seemed to freeze for a moment. A Level 4 Pentagon card indicated significant importance, information that should never be ignored, yet Karen brushed it aside as if it didn't exist. With a quick, dismissive flick, Carlton's card was shuffled in with the rest, unnoticed, unacknowledged. No questions, no verification, only sheer indifference. It was an immensely important moment, but to Karen, it meant nothing. She didn't bother to learn who was standing before her. To her, Carlton was just a suspect, a man whose skin color she didn't deem worthy of respect, regardless of how many stars he might have worn on his uniform. This wasn't a lawful check. It was a punishment masked as procedure. Carlton clearly felt that she had seen the card, but deliberately ignored it. That blatant dismissal was like a punch to his pride. Yet Carlton wasn't surprised. He knew all too well that in situations like this, some people would always choose to ignore the truth when it didn't fit their narrative of control. Karen was one of them. But silence wouldn't last forever. A sense of injustice rose inside Carlton like an unstoppable wave. Every time he suffered such abuses of power, even without overt resistance, a quiet rebellion stirred within him. He could never accept being treated as worthless simply because of his appearance, because of racial prejudice. Still, Carlton didn't act rashly. He maintained his calm, refusing to display anger. Resistance at this moment would only worsen the situation. Karen's force might have seemed overwhelming, but his dignity could not be broken by a few crude words and violent gestures. "You're making a serious mistake," Carlton said, his voice steady, unhurried, unafraid. "You have no right to search me without legal cause. You are acting unlawfully, officer." These words, weren't a threat, they were a warning, a reminder that her abuse of power would not go uncontested, even if he didn't resist physically. Carlton wasn't expecting Karen to change instantly, but he wanted her to know that what was happening was not invisible, not forgotten. Karen didn't answer immediately. She didn't have to, for everything had already been decided in her mind. She continued focusing on asserting her dominance, not once pausing to consider whether her actions were lawful or just. She merely wanted to see Carlton submit, to obey her commands without protest. The glow from the crowd's phones grew brighter, reflecting off curious faces, some capturing the scene on video. Still, Karen showed no sign of easing up. She didn't care about the attention from outsiders. She didn't want interference. The eyes around her only made her more determined, as if those witnesses were powerless bystanders in her world. Karen's indifference wasn't just verbal, it was in every action. She didn't stop to heed Carlton's warning, didn't pause to verify his identity. To her, it was just a game of control, one where she could move pieces without regard for truth or justice. Carlton, knowing he couldn't immediately change this injustice, still refused to surrender. His calm was his most powerful form of resistance. He understood that not everything could be changed at once, but he also knew one thing for sure: he would not bow. Karen still stood there, arms crossed, her gaze never leaving Carlton. She refused to let a single second pass without feeling like she was in control of the situation. At this moment, everything was unfolding exactly as Karen wanted, or so she thought. Every word she uttered, every action she took exuded an oppressive authority, and in her eyes, Carlton was nothing more than a subject to be checked and controlled. Throughout the confrontation, however, Carlton maintained an astonishing calm. There was no sign of confusion or fear. He didn't complain, didn't resist. He simply stayed silent, waiting for the right moment to act. As Karen repeated her unreasonable orders, demanding he exit the vehicle and comply, Carlton realized there was nothing left to discuss. He had been patient long enough. It was time to exercise his rights. Rights that came not only from his title, but from his responsibility to himself and the values he stood for. Carlton took a deep breath and calmly spoke. "I would like to make a phone call." The sentence was simple and brief, but carried a weight that could not be ignored. He wasn't demanding justice, he was making a modest, lawful request. Karen looked at him, a flicker of surprise flashing in her eyes before it was quickly replaced by mockery. She didn't believe a word he said. To her, his request was nothing but a joke. "A phone call?" Karen scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think someone at the Pentagon is going to pick up for you? Don't play smart." She had no idea that her mocking question revealed the false nature of the authority she clung to. Karen didn't even consider that Carlton might hold power far beyond anything she could imagine. Remaining composed, Carlton stared directly at Karen, unwavering. He wouldn't let her mockery rattle him. This was a pivotal moment, and he would not back down. "You may think that," he said, calmly but firmly, "but I request to make this call." Karen said nothing, her expression still dripping with disdain and skepticism. She had no inkling that this simple request would trigger consequences far beyond her control. She thought her authority was absolute. She thought wrong. Without hesitation, Carlton pulled his phone from his pocket and began dialing. For him, this was not just a phone call. It was a declaration of true power, the kind that could not be stripped away by arrogance or ignorance. As he made the call, Karen kept her hand lazily resting on her weapon, her eyes fixed on him. She still felt as if she were atop the situation, certain that he could not escape her authority. What she didn't realize was that this call would make her authority irrelevant. Carlton reached into his jacket and drew out a secure, military-grade phone. His movements were deliberate, yet swift, fingers gliding expertly across the screen. This wasn't an ordinary phone. It was a device reserved for high-ranking military officials. A call from this device was no trivial matter. Karen, still ignorant of the significance of his actions, stood rigid, mocking and skeptical. But Carlton didn't care. He made no rushed moves. Everything was calculated. He tapped the screen once more, and the call connected. "Pentagon, how can we assist?" came the deep, professional voice over the speaker. Carlton wasted no time. Accustomed to emergencies, he responded crisply. "Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, I am being unlawfully detained by local police in Schley County, Georgia. Immediate intervention request." The voice on the other end immediately shifted to a tone of seriousness. Within seconds, the call was escalated up the chain of command. No hesitation, no questions. Carlton had done what needed to be done, and now everything was set in motion. On the other side, the senior officer didn't ask unnecessary questions. After receiving Carlton's report, the command was immediate. "Deploy a response unit now. Notify federal law enforcement. Immediate intervention required." Within minutes, forces from the Pentagon were mobilizing, and their arrival would completely upend the situation Karen thought she had under control. Karen stood there, eyes locked on Carlton as he finished his call. She had no way of knowing that her world was about to collapse. At first she thought the call would change nothing. She assumed it was a bluff from a desperate man. But as she observed the subtle shift in Carlton's demeanor, his confidence, his calm, a sense of unease began to creep into her mind. When the call ended and silence descended so thick you could hear every breath, Karen could feel the change in the air. The wave of authority she thought she held was crumbling. Everything she had believed, her superiority, her invulnerability, suddenly felt hollow, collapsing right before her eyes. Her expression hardened, her lips pressed into a tight line. The mockery in her gaze faded, replaced by something else: fear, uncertainty. Karen realized, all too late, that the power she had so arrogantly wielded was now being stripped away. A force from the Pentagon, a power she could neither dismiss nor control, had been activated, and she was about to learn that the real power was never hers to command. Carlton placed the phone to his ear without a hint of urgency. His fingers moved calmly and precisely, entering a code reserved only for those with the highest clearance. On the other end was a crucial military contact, accessible only to those with sufficient rank to intervene in an emergency. This was not an ordinary call. It was a strategic move, a decision carefully calculated over the course of his service. It was the moment he needed to speak out, and he knew it would immediately change the course of events. The voice of the duty officer at the Pentagon came through the receiver, gentle but firm. "Pentagon, what do you need?" Carlton wasted no time. He understood that in emergency situations, clarity was paramount. There could be no hesitation, no uncertainty. He spoke directly and swiftly. "Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, I am being unlawfully detained by local police in Schley County, Georgia. I request immediate intervention." There was no panic in his voice, no fear. His tone was calm, but full of unwavering authority. He was asking for nothing but justice, justice that could not be crushed by the power of a police officer who didn't understand her limits. The other end of the line did not respond immediately. A brief silence stretched for a few seconds, just long enough for Carlton to sense the gravity of the situation. Then, as if on cue, the call was escalated to a higher command, and a resolute voice came through. "Situation confirmed, orders issued, deploying support forces immediately." Instantly, the response protocol was activated. The commanding officers were notified, and within moments, everything moved into action within the quiet efficiency of a perfectly calibrated system. Though no sound broke the silence around Carlton, everything was happening with surgical precision. Orders rippled through military channels, and federal forces began to mobilize. The entire system kicked into gear. No delays, no hesitation. Signals were transmitted, and at once, Pentagon intervention had been unleashed, like an underground current preparing to surface. Within minutes, black SUVs from the Pentagon sped toward the scene, racing across the empty roads like dark shadows. Their headlights cut through the dusk, casting enormous, menacing silhouettes. These vehicles were not mere transports. They were symbols of real power, a force Karen could not hope to control. With the arrival of the federal forces, the atmosphere thickened, becoming tenser than ever. This was no longer a confrontation between a local police officer and a civilian. The surrounding bystanders quickly sensed the dramatic shift. They were no longer witnessing a simple roadside inspection. The crowd stood silently, watching the black SUVs approach, realizing that a far greater force was now in command, and everything Karen thought she controlled was slipping away. The headlights illuminated the scene, casting harsh reflections onto the road, highlighting a reality no one had expected. The onlookers felt an unsettling mixture of fear and a strange sense of justice being restored. Phones continued to record, but now not just a lone police officer. People were documenting the moment when a mightier system intervened. Karen stood frozen, unable to believe her eyes. She watched as 3 black SUVs with special plates bore down on her. These were not like any police vehicles she had ever encountered. She had believed she was in complete control, that her authority was absolute. But now, with the military's powerful vehicles stopping before her, Karen felt a deep surge of dread. She could not comprehend what was happening. The sudden turn of events hit her like a massive wave, shattering everything she thought she had secured. Her eyes widened in disbelief at what she was witnessing. The Pentagon had intervened in this situation. Karen felt the very foundation of her power crumbling in an instant. She could not fathom how a simple phone call could summon such overwhelming authority. The world she had built, the sense of dominance she thought she held, now lay in ruins. The black SUVs blocked everything she once believed unshakable. Her demeanor changed instantly. She no longer projected the same confidence, no longer held the arrogance that had driven her into this confrontation. She began to feel the undeniable truth. Her power was under siege. The crowd around her, too, started realizing that it was not Karen but those on the other end of Carlton's call who truly wielded authority. As the military vehicles came to a halt and uniformed personnel stepped out, Karen felt herself cornered, with no way out. She was no longer the enforcer of the law. She was now merely a bystander, watching as her world collapsed before her eyes. Several bystanders had recorded the incident. The short video quickly went viral on social media, sparking a wave of attention and outrage. The scene that unfolded on Highway 200 was no longer just a confrontation between 2 individuals. It had become a battle between power and dignity. When Pentagon police vehicles arrived, completely shifting the situation, no one could have predicted that what was happening would alter the social landscape so profoundly. The crowd standing nearby, those who had unintentionally become witnesses to this clash, couldn't escape the overwhelming tension. The scene, seemingly ordinary at first glance, carried a deep sense of unease they had never experienced before. The red and blue lights still flickered across the deserted road, the atmosphere thick and heavy, like a ticking time bomb ready to explode. Some in the crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, quickly pulled out their phones. At first, it was just a few taps, and a few people were recording without realizing that these clips would ignite a massive storm on social media. But every moment captured, Karen standing in an imposing posture, Carlton remaining calm and composed, turned the tense confrontation into undeniable evidence of injustice. Phones were raised high, screens lighting up one after another, and within seconds, the short videos began uploading across social media platforms. From Instagram to Twitter, from Facebook to TikTok, a whirlwind of information started to spread. No one could control the speed of its dissemination, and everyone present realized they were becoming part of a much larger movement. The video was posted with a simple yet powerful title, "Police Discriminate Against a Lieutenant General." The footage, just about 30 seconds long, was enough to grab viewers' attention. It showed Karen demanding Carlton exit the vehicle, place his hands on the hood, and displaying her cold, disrespectful attitude toward a high-ranking official. But the most striking moment was when Carlton's Pentagon Level 4 ID card was briefly shown, completely disregarded by Karen in an act of blatant oppression. The footage was not just about injustice toward one man. It became a clear manifestation of unchecked power and discrimination. Within minutes of the video's posting, public attention surged. Early viewers were stunned by Karen's behavior. Less than 10 minutes later, view counts skyrocketed. Comments flooded in. Some labeled Karen violent, others pointed out clear racial profiling, and many could not believe that a police officer would treat someone as high-ranking as Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes in such a manner. Posts sharing the video exploded across Twitter, with hashtags like Justice for Carlton, racial profiling, and police brutality quickly dominating trending topics. In a short span of time, the video spread everywhere, amassing millions of views, shares, and comments. An uncontrollable storm of information had been unleashed. People began sharing the video with friends, colleagues, and family members, and engaging in heated discussions about the unfolding event. Residents of the area, who had initially only witnessed the event from afar, suddenly found themselves part of a larger battle for justice, not because they intended to be, but because the viral footage had turned them into witnesses to the truth. The community's reaction grew increasingly powerful. Not long after the video circulated, civil rights organizations, such as Black Lives Matter and the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, issued public statements demanding an immediate investigation into Karen's actions and her abuse of authority. Legal experts began speaking out, criticizing Karen's conduct and affirming that ignoring a Pentagon Level 4 ID constituted a serious violation of civil liberties. It didn't stop there. Major news outlets began reaching out to the bystanders who had captured the footage, seeking interviews. Questions flooded the media. Are police officers allowed to exercise unchecked power? How could a police officer treat a high-ranking official like Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes this way? On major news sites, the video was showcased as a prime example of injustice within law enforcement, highlighting systemic racial discrimination and the urgent need for reform. Karen, upon realizing how far the video had spread, began to panic. She couldn't believe that one of her actions could trigger such a massive uproar. Questions surfaced about whether she could continue in her role at all. Investigations by the police department and the Pentagon commenced. An undeniable truth was gradually emerging, and Karen realized she was no longer in control of the situation. Black, unmarked SUVs silently sped down the deserted road, heading straight toward Carlton and Karen. They made no noise other than the soft hum of tires gliding over the pavement, yet their presence weighed heavily in the air, as if time itself had been suspended. These vehicles were not just modes of transportation, they were symbols of true power, of a force Karen could not control. In the desolate stretch of Highway 280, already quiet, now became the stage for a sudden and unmistakable shift. The tinted windows of the black SUVs hid the cold, watchful faces inside. These vehicles were unlike any police cruisers Karen had ever driven. They weren't merely functional, they were potent symbols, birthed from a hierarchy of authority that Karen, despite her own badge and power, could never challenge. As the SUVs neared the scene, all attention seemed to shift toward them. The crowd, who had stood idly watching the tense standoff between Carlton and Karen, now began to realize that these vehicles weren't ordinary police units. They were a clear sign of an undeniable intervention, of a larger force stepping in. These SUVs didn't just carry soldiers, they carried a message. True power didn't reside in the hands of a local officer. Karen saw the black SUVs approaching, and the certainty in her eyes began to waver. She had never seen vehicles like these in all her career, and that unknown made her uneasy. Though she said nothing, deep down Karen knew that something far bigger was unfolding. At that moment, she realized the power she thought she wielded was nothing compared to what was coming. The black SUVs turned off into the clearing, their tires kicking up dust and gravel. They stopped directly in front of Carlton's black sedan, forming an impenetrable wall of metal. The SUV doors swung open, and uniformed soldiers stepped out, each clad in dark military gear, adorned with clear insignias and ranks. They stood straight, their faces betraying no emotion, their eyes razor-sharp. Karen couldn't help but feel the chasm between them and herself. She had always considered herself powerful, but now the presence of these soldiers made it clear that she was no longer in control. In these few seconds, all Karen could feel was the suffocating pressure of authority, the kind that rendered her insignificant. Soon, one of the military officers stepped toward Karen and asked, "Officer Wilburn, is there a problem here?" His voice was cold, devoid of leniency or curiosity. Questions like that were not ones Karen could easily answer. She fumbled for words as she looked at the soldier, unsure of how to respond. The black SUVs were an undeniable statement. She was no longer the one directing the situation. An overwhelming sense of discomfort rose in Karen's chest. She could feel the shift happening and knew there was no way to turn it back. Those soldiers, even while simply standing there, created an invisible barrier around her, isolating her, oppressing her within a scene she had once thought she commanded. As the black SUVs from the Pentagon pulled up, all attention shifted to the military personnel stepping out of the vehicles. However, just as the presence of the military forces began to alter the dynamics of the situation, another movement stirred within the crowd. A green Ford Crown Victoria police car quietly pulled into the clearing, carrying Sergeant Boyd, one of the most respected figures within the local police department. Sergeant Boyd held a high rank, but he was neither a bureaucrat nor a brute. He was a man respected by those under his command, not because he oppressed them, but because he knew how to assess situations from multiple angles and used reason to resolve problems. Yet, he hadn't anticipated that what awaited him at the scene would far exceed anything he had imagined. Boyd's car rolled to a gentle stop, the sound of tires crunching over gravel soft and deliberate. The door opened, and Boyd stepped out, clad in his police uniform, his face showing neither urgency nor tension. He paused for a few seconds, taking in the scene, the black SUVs, the upright soldiers, and especially Karen, still standing there, hand resting on her gun grip, her gaze hardened, as if she were completely in control. Boyd approached without speaking, simply observing and analyzing the situation. At this point, all eyes turned toward him. His slow, calm movements indicated that he was meticulously evaluating everything, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Karen noticed Boyd's arrival, and a subtle shift appeared in her demeanor. She was familiar with Boyd, but in this situation, she sensed that a superior officer could change the entire game. Karen didn't rush, but her eyes couldn't hide her growing anxiety. She had planned for everything, except for Boyd's arrival and his potential to overturn her authority. As Boyd neared Carlton, he moved deliberately, his gaze settling on Carlton's calm demeanor before scanning the surroundings. There was no urgency, only careful observation and a deep sense of responsibility. He paused for a few seconds before speaking. "Lieutenant General Hayes," Boyd asked, his voice deep and steady, "may I hear your side of the situation?" Carlton looked at Boyd calmly. There was no panic, no tension in his eyes. He recognized that Boyd was different from Karen, someone who could understand the situation beyond surface appearances. When Boyd asked, Carlton knew he wouldn't need many words to clarify everything. "Yes, I am Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, Pentagon. I have been unlawfully detained here without any legal cause. I request immediate intervention." Boyd didn't react right away. He simply stood there, his eyes locked onto Carlton. Then he turned toward Karen, his gaze growing colder and sharper. Karen immediately sensed the shift in Boyd's attitude. She had always assumed Boyd would side with her, as most local officers usually did. But now, Boyd's expression showed no support for what was happening. Karen realized Boyd was capable of making independent decisions, and he wouldn't easily condone misconduct. Boyd turned back to Carlton. After a moment of silence, he said, "Thank you for informing me. Officer Karen, I need you to explain the situation immediately. What exactly have you done?" Karen couldn't hide the panic flickering in her eyes. She felt something crumbling inside her. Boyd was a man of principle, and he was not one to overlook mistakes. Even without saying it outright, the skepticism in his gaze was enough to make Karen feel cornered. Boyd didn't let Karen answer immediately. He surveyed the scene again, analyzing every detail before continuing. "I will request the Pentagon's rapid response team to verify the situation. If there has been any misconduct, we will address it accordingly." Listening to Boyd's words, Karen realized the situation was slipping completely out of her hands. What she had believed she controlled was now beyond her grasp. Boyd was the one person capable of shifting the entire outcome, and it was clear he was not backing her actions. Boyd turned back to Carlton, his gaze softening slightly. "I will ensure that everything is handled properly. Thank you, General, for maintaining your composure under these circumstances." Boyd's words were not just a reassurance. They were a confirmation that Karen's perceived authority was collapsing. Intervention from the Pentagon was inevitable, and the local authority Karen had so arrogantly wielded was steadily slipping away. Everything in the air seemed to freeze as the military forces began to close in. Their steps were unhurried, yet filled with certainty. Each black SUV, each soldier, was a piece of the intervention machinery that Karen had never anticipated. What she had believed to be a situation under her control was now crumbling before her eyes. One of the soldiers approached Carlton, his gaze sharp, showing no surprise at the unfolding scene. His eyes briefly swept over the handcuffs binding Carlton's wrists, then lifted to meet Carlton's calm, steady face, the face of a man who had remained composed under Karen's blatant abuse of authority. Without a word, without asking for an explanation, the soldier nodded slightly and moved forward to unlock the cuffs. The cold metal binding Carlton's wrists was gradually released, and the sense of freedom that followed was indescribable. It wasn't merely the physical relief of being freed, it was the liberation from the wrongful control Karen had imposed upon him. Though Carlton showed no outward reaction, he could feel the shift in the atmosphere as each steel clasp was undone. When the cuffs were fully removed, the soldier turned to Carlton, his gaze respectful but without arrogance. "You are not the person we are looking for," he said simply. Those words did not merely confirm Carlton's release, they affirmed that the Pentagon's intervention had decisively reclaimed control. The surrounding onlookers stood silently, witnessing the undeniable shift in the situation. The crowd, once passive spectators, now realized they were witnessing an irreversible change. They had not only seen a local officer's failure, they had witnessed the collapse of the false authority Karen had so carefully crafted. The transformation became even clearer as Karen began to feel the unease rising within her. She could not ignore the change in the air. Carlton's identity had been verified, and the absolute power she believed she wielded now meant nothing. Everything she had once held in her grasp was slipping away. Karen said nothing, but her expression changed noticeably. A quiet panic began to swell inside her. She saw the change in the soldier's eyes, in the attitude of the people around her, and she could feel their growing doubt about her actions. Deep down, she knew she had made a grave mistake. The first symptom of panic was silence. Karen didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. The composure she had maintained for so long cracked, and there was nothing she could do to stop the silent wave of collapse from washing over her. She realized she had failed to verify critical details, had overlooked glaring signs from the start. Though unspoken, Karen began to sense that her career might be destroyed in this single moment. She had never imagined that a routine confrontation could spiral into such a monumental downfall. The military forces were not there for a minor incident. They were there because of the blatant abuse of power she had committed. As the black SUVs departed the scene, Karen felt as if she had been left behind in a hollow silence. The crowd around her no longer looked on passively. They stared at her with scrutinizing eyes, eyes she once could command, but now everything had changed. A deep fear began to envelop Karen, leaving her disoriented. Every poor decision, every oppressive action now returned as shattered fragments, making her realize she had completely lost control. The scene on Highway 280 was no longer a personal confrontation. A battle over power, justice, and injustice was unfolding before the eyes of the crowd, as onlookers began recording every moment with their phones. The already tense atmosphere turned particularly grave when Colonel Gaines from the Pentagon arrived at the scene, stepping into a conflict he knew would completely shift the course of events. At first, everything seemed relatively ordinary. A clash between a local police officer and a high-ranking individual could have been dismissed as a simple administrative check, but when military forces intervened, when the black Pentagon SUVs rushed onto the scene, everything changed. Karen, once the figure in control, suddenly realized she no longer held the upper hand. Now, with Colonel Gaines's arrival, Karen's authority vanished. Colonel Gaines was a key figure at the Pentagon, a seasoned leader who understood exactly how to handle emergencies, especially cases of abuse of power. In his eyes, there was no tolerance for wrongdoing. Colonel Gaines stepped out of the military vehicle, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. Every step he took was deliberate, and his presence alone seemed to fill the air with an undeniable force. Without saying a word, his arrival made it clear that the situation had reached a critical point. Karen couldn't help but feel the shift in the air as Colonel Gaines approached. She had thought she was in control, that her authority was unchallengeable, but now she realized her world was collapsing around her. Gaines looked straight at Karen, his gaze unwavering. Even as Karen stood there, hand still on her weapon, lips pressed tightly together, he remained cold and composed. The military officers surrounding him didn't move either. Although the scene was charged with tension, there was no chaos, no shouting, only an intense silence that was impossible to ignore. Colonel Gaines stopped in front of Karen, saying nothing at first. He simply stood there, studying her, assessing the situation. Karen was overcome by a quiet panic. She had not prepared for this. She had believed she could maintain her authority regardless of what happened, but the Pentagon's intervention had changed everything. "Officer Wilburn," Colonel Gaines finally said, his voice firm and devoid of any softness, "I demand an immediate explanation for your actions." Karen felt cornered. She could not argue. She could not lie. She could not evade responsibility any longer. At this moment, no one could save her. The Pentagon soldiers present were not there to be her allies. They were there to uphold justice, awaiting their commander's instructions. Colonel Gaines was not a man to be manipulated by words or arrogance. He would not forgive abuses of power. Karen had believed that wearing a badge gave her the right to do anything she wished, but she had forgotten there were those with far greater authority, and Colonel Gaines was now the one making the decisions. "You cannot abuse your authority like this," he continued, his gaze never leaving her. "You have committed a serious violation, and we will not tolerate it." Karen stood frozen, unable to speak. She was beginning to realize the enormity of her mistake. The identity she had so rudely disregarded, Carlton's, now left her with no defense. Standing before Colonel Gaines, she no longer felt like an officer enforcing the law, but like a violator facing justice. The crowd around them began to understand that this was not just an administrative stop. They were witnessing a shift, and they knew that things would never be the same again. "You will be investigated for your actions," Gaines said, offering no further explanation. "We will not allow this injustice to continue." At that moment, Karen could do nothing but stand still, her eyes filled with fear and helplessness. Everything had spiraled out of her control, and now only an inevitable collapse remained. The scene on Highway 280 was no longer a confrontation between a local police officer and a lieutenant general. Everything had far surpassed the bounds of control and authority, and when Police Chief Nix arrived, the tension in the air grew heavier than ever. Nix, the highest authority in the local police force, was a man who did not tolerate abuse of power. As he stepped out of his patrol car, The silence was so profound that even the crowd's breathing could be heard. Each of his steps left an indelible mark. He was the only one who could change the course of events at that moment, and every eye turned toward him. Karen stood there, her hand still resting on her gun, her face frozen. She no longer wore the confidence she once had, the power she had once felt slipping through her fingers. As Chief Nix approached, showing no sign of negotiation or leniency, his gaze was sharp as a blade. He wasted no time. He looked at Karen directly, his tone unwavering. "Officer Wilburn," Nix began, his voice deep and full of authority, "I am ordering you to surrender your badge and weapon immediately." Nix's command rang out without a hint of mercy or courtesy. This was not a request, it was an order that could not be refused. All Karen could do was stand there, stunned, her eyes wide, unable to hide her bewilderment. She had never imagined she would face a moment like this, where she would have to confront the collapse of everything she believed she controlled. Karen could hardly believe what she had just heard. She had always believed that the power she wielded could never be shaken, that her badge would be her ultimate shield. But now she was being ordered to hand over her badge and weapon, something she had never even dared to imagine. The feeling of punishment, of being stripped away from the position she had clung to, left her reeling. She said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her gun, as if trying to hold on to the last shred of her pride. But Nix gave her no chance. He took another step forward, his eyes locked on her without pity or softness. "Do you understand my order?" Nix continued, his voice unchanging. "Now, don't make me repeat myself." Each word from Nix hit like a direct slap to the mask of authority Karen had worn for so many years. Anyone watching could see there was no way out for her. This moment was no longer about justice or law enforcement. It was a public rebuke, an exposure of Karen's abuse of power, the end of the little empire she had built in her mind. The crowd around them remained silent, but the atmosphere grew heavier. Everyone recognized that this wasn't a routine administrative check. It was a revolution within the police force itself, the toppling of a corrupt regime and the restoration of justice. Karen could feel every eye on her. She felt the burning presence of phones raised high, recording the moment, knowing it would soon spread across social media. She wasn't just losing a confrontation, she was becoming a symbol of a corrupt system's collapse. Unable to resist, Karen slowly removed her gun from her belt and placed it on the ground. She then reached into her pocket, pulled out her badge, and handed it to Nix. In that moment, all her pride was stripped away. Karen's career was over. Everything she had once believed in and built had crumbled. Standing before Chief Nix, she realized she hadn't just lost her authority, she had lost everything she had once taken pride in. Nix's demand, though simple in action, carried enormous weight. Karen had been completely stripped of her control. Nix said nothing more. He simply stood for a moment longer, looking at Karen, then turned and walked away. The crowd around them remained silent, but the shift in their demeanor was unmistakable. The entire area wasn't just witnessing the downfall of a local officer, it was witnessing the beginning of a rebuilding of justice within the system itself. Karen stood there, her eyes devoid of pride or power. She could no longer recognize herself in the mirror, the person who had once believed she could control everything. All that remained was utter defeat in a future shrouded in uncertainty from which she could not escape. As the video of the Highway 280 incident spread widely across social media, everything began to change. The story of General Carlton Hayes, a decorated lieutenant general subjected to the dehumanizing abuse of power by a local police officer, quickly escalated into a national reckoning. What began as a local act of misconduct was no longer seen in isolation. It became the mirror that reflected the deep fractures within the American legal and law enforcement systems. The footage was stark. The confrontation between General Hayes and Officer Karen Wilburn was recorded in full clarity. Her dismissive tone, the refusal to acknowledge his credentials, the forceful arrest, all captured in real time. The video was raw, undeniable, and painful to watch. But perhaps That's why it spread with such explosive speed. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for General Hayes surged to the top of Twitter and Instagram. In parallel, hashtags like racial profiling, police brutality, and end racial discrimination exploded across platforms, carrying the weight of thousands, soon millions, of voices demanding answers. This wasn't just about one man. This wasn't even just about one officer's misconduct. For many, it was the final, undeniable proof that even the most accomplished, the most disciplined, the most respected black man in uniform could still be subjected to suspicion, disrespect, and physical harm simply because of the color of his skin. The image of a high-ranking military official standing calm, composed, and restrained while a visibly hostile officer ignored his credentials became the embodiment of two Americas, and the world took notice. Justice advocates quickly mobilized. Civil rights organizations, including the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, and the ACLU, released statements within hours, not only condemning Officer Wilburn's actions but framing the incident within the broader historical context of systemic racism and law enforcement. Petitions calling for her suspension and a full independent investigation garnered over 1 million signatures within 24 hours. National figures began re-sharing the video. Celebrities added their voices. Influencers across TikTok and Instagram urged their followers to act, to write to their representatives, to attend local protests, to call out injustice whenever it appeared, especially in uniforms meant to protect. Major cities saw protests forming overnight. From Atlanta to Los Angeles, from Chicago to Boston, demonstrators held signs bearing Hayes' name. Some quoted his rank, Lieutenant General, United States Army, while others asked a haunting question: if they can do this to him, what chance do we have? In the Capitol, a small but growing crowd gathered outside the Department of Justice. Within 36 hours of the video's release, it was clear this was no longer a trending story. What was a movement? Cable news networks scrambled to cover it. CNN ran back-to-back coverage with legal analysts, former military officials, and community leaders weighing in. MSNBC focused on the systemic elements, connecting Hayes' story to decades of unequal treatment. Even Fox News, often slow to embrace stories about police abuse, ran extended segments about the need for accountability in all ranks. No angle could ignore the clear, undeniable abuse captured on film. But perhaps the most defining moment in public reaction came not from politicians or pundits, but from ordinary people. In Facebook comment threads, TikTok duets, Instagram reels, and Reddit discussions, personal stories began pouring in. Veterans of color shared their own experiences with being pulled over, disrespected, questioned, even after giving decades of their life in service to their country. Young black students recounted the fear their parents instilled in them when learning how to survive a traffic stop. Teachers spoke of using the video in classrooms to explain the concepts of power, race, and dignity. The emotional resonance cut deep. Especially on Twitter, discussions evolved beyond the moment of arrest. Users analyzed, frame by frame, what Karen Wilburn had done, how she ignored the clearly visible Pentagon access card, how she spoke over Hayes' calm attempts to clarify, how she escalated rather than de-escalated. Meanwhile, others pointed out how calm Hayes remained, how he never raised his voice, never lashed out, never lost control, not because he wasn't angry, but because he had been here before, because, tragically, this wasn't new. Prominent politicians quickly stepped in. Senator Kamala Harris was among the first to issue a strong statement, demanding an immediate and independent investigation, calling Wilburn's actions a disgrace to every officer who wears the badge with honor. Representative Ilhan Omar echoed that call, but went further, demanding congressional hearings into local police departments and proposing renewed oversight measures. Cory Booker, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Ayanna Pressley joined a press conference where they held up an enlarged still from the video, Hayes in uniform, hands restrained, and asked, "What does accountability look like when power protects itself. The image of Officer Wilburn also began circulating, accompanied by stories from eyewitnesses who stepped forward to recount the entire confrontation. Their voices, clear, unwavering, and consistent, added layers of credibility to Hayes' ordeal. One woman, a nurse who had stopped nearby, gave a tearful interview on local radio. "I kept thinking, she has to realize who he is. She has to stop." But she didn't, and that terrified me. Platforms like Facebook and TikTok became grounds for deeper civic engagement. Users uploaded explainers, legal breakdowns, reflections, and tributes. The discussion didn't just go wide, it went deep. What does it mean to serve your country if your country still doesn't see your humanity? What does reform look like when the uniform becomes a shield from consequence? The hashtags kept multiplying. Justice for General Hayes, police reform now, uniforms don't erase racism, calm under fire. In some cases, entire TikTok accounts were created to follow the developments in the case, dissect legal updates, and track legislative responses. Young activists used the moment to connect Hayes' case with other, lesser-known stories, turning it into an educational series on modern policing and racial inequality. By the end of the week, what had started as a dash cam clip became a national touchstone. Hayes' name was on protest signs, op-eds, policy proposals, and community murals. His composure became a symbol, his silence in the face of provocation an emblem of strength. And in contrast, Wilburn's refusal to back down, even when faced with overwhelming evidence, a cautionary tale of unchecked power. The story extended beyond Karen. It was no longer about her badge or his rank. It became about how power operates, who gets believed, and what justice really requires. The crowd was no longer a passive audience. They had become the movement. They were no longer scrolling, retweeting, or watching from afar. They were writing, marching, organizing, speaking. They were calling for not just one officer's accountability, but an entire system's transformation. In the days that followed, Hayes himself remained silent, but the world spoke. Loudly, clearly, and with one voice. This is not acceptable. This must change. And, perhaps most powerfully of all, a new question emerged. If dignity could stand still that day on Highway 280, can the rest of the nation learn to walk with it? After the media storm had passed, and the country's attention shifted to newer headlines, the name General Carlton Hayes no longer dominated the airwaves. But for many, his silence was not absence. It was presence in its truest form. While others debated, speculated, and shouted on screens, he remained quiet, purposefully, and when he finally chose to reappear before the public, it wasn't at a political rally or a primetime talk show. It was a modest community conference held in the echoing gymnasium of a city activity center, the kind of place more often used for youth basketball games than for moments of civic reckoning. There were no glitzy banners, no security detail, no reporters clamoring for sound bites, only rows of folding chairs, filled by teachers, veterans, students, local clergy, and working parents. People who had followed his story not as entertainment, but as a mirror of something far deeper. General Hayes entered the room with the same quiet confidence that had come to define him. He wore his full uniform, crisp, polished, impeccable, but there were no medals pinned on display, no visible symbols of rank, only the understated weight of dignity. He nodded to a few familiar faces in the front row, then walked slowly to the podium set at the center of the room, a bottle of water, a simple mic, no teleprompter, no script. When he began to speak, the room seemed to still itself to better hear him. "I'm not here today to recount what happened to me," he said, his voice deep but even. "You already know." There was no tension in his words, no bitterness. Just fact, delivered without ornament. "I am here," he continued, "to talk about something more important, how we choose to respond when faced with injustice." His words were firm, not accusatory, and unlike so many who had taken to social media in outrage on his behalf, Hayes did not mention the name Karen Wilburn. He did not list her wrongs. He did not recount the humiliation. He left the known unsaid, and in doing so turned the audience's attention away from personalities and toward principles. In my life, he said, pausing just long enough to allow each word to land, I have witnessed every form of injustice. In war zones, in government offices, in quiet corners of American towns. I have seen cruelty committed in the name of law. I have seen indifference dressed up as neutrality. And yes, I have felt the sting of being disrespected not because of my actions, but because of what I look like. He took a breath. His tone never wavered, not once. But what I've learned, he said, is that anger is not the strongest weapon we have. Calmness is. Anger ignites quickly, it burns hot and fast. But calmness, the kind that comes from deep conviction and a sense of purpose, that can sustain a fire long enough to change even the coldest system. He recounted moments in his career, not to boast, but to demonstrate. He told of times when colleagues had dismissed him, when higher-ups had silenced his ideas, when communities had judged him before hearing him. And yet, he said, those were not the moments that defined him. It wasn't the injustice that shaped me, it was how I responded to it. I am not someone who doesn't feel anger, he said clearly. I'm human, and sometimes the things I've seen would make anyone want to scream. But I've also learned this. If I let anger lead me, I lose my clarity. I lose the goal. That goal, he emphasized, was never revenge, never retribution. It was change, not of a single person, but of the very framework that allowed that person to abuse power without consequence. If we respond to hate with hate, to injustice with injustice, then we have already conceded defeat. Applause began slowly, hesitantly, as if the crowd wasn't sure if clapping was appropriate in such solemn clarity. But Hayes didn't wait for validation. He pressed on. Dignity is not something anyone can give you, and more importantly, it is not something anyone can take from you. They can insult you. They can try to humiliate you. They can question your worth. But you decide whether to accept that narrative. You decide whether to stand straight or to let them bend you. There was something powerful in his stillness. He wasn't rallying them. He was holding up a mirror. Justice is not fueled by rage. It is powered by resolve, by strategy, by relentless, disciplined effort. And it starts not in courts or Congress, but in how each of us chooses to walk through the world. I never set out to be anyone's symbol, he said softly. I just tried to do the right thing, one situation at a time, one conversation at a time. He admitted that change would take decades, that setbacks would come, that progress might look invisible, until suddenly it wasn't. But every seed matters. Every quiet decision to hold your head high. Every refusal to answer cruelty with cruelty. Every young person who chooses discipline over chaos, strategy over fury. That's a building block. And then, without warning, he concluded, justice is not an explosive burst of anger. Justice is a slow, persistent flame, burning patiently and steadily until the whole world feels its heat. And then he stepped away from the microphone. No music played, no slogans were chanted. The room did not erupt in frenzy. Instead, everyone stood, slowly, in unison, and clapped. It was not the applause of celebrity. It was the recognition of truth. Some wept, others bowed their heads, but all felt the same thing. They had not merely heard a speech. They had been entrusted with a duty. That day, General Hayes did not reclaim honor. He redefined it, and in doing so, he reminded a generation that the true path forward is not paved in rage, but in calm, principled perseverance. After the media storm had passed and the country's attention shifted to newer headlines, the name General Carlton Hayes no longer dominated the airwaves. But for many, his silence was not absence. It was presence in its truest form. While others debated, speculated, and shouted on screens, he remained quiet, purposefully, and when he finally chose to reappear before the public, it wasn't at a political rally or a prime-time talk show. It was a modest community conference, held in the echoing gymnasium of a city activity center, the kind of place more often used for youth basketball games than for moments of civic reckoning. There were no glitzy banners, no security detail, no reporters clamoring for sound bites. Only rows of folding chairs filled by teachers, veterans, students, local clergy, and working parents. People who had followed his story not as entertainment, but as a mirror of something far deeper. General Hayes entered the room with the same quiet confidence that had come to define him. He wore his full uniform, crisp, polished, impeccable, but there were no medals pinned on display, no visible symbols of rank, only the understated weight of dignity. He nodded to a few familiar faces in the front row, then walked slowly to the podium set at the center of the room. A bottle of water, a simple mic, no teleprompter, no script. When he began to speak, the room seemed to still itself to better hear him. "I'm not here today to recount what happened to me," he said, his voice deep but even. "You already know." There was no tension in his words, no bitterness, just fact, delivered without ornament. "I am here," he continued, "to talk about something more important, how we choose to respond when faced with injustice." His words were firm, not accusatory. And unlike so many who had taken to social media in outrage on his behalf, Hayes did not mention the name Karen Wilburn. He did not list her wrongs. He did not recount the humiliation. He left the known unsaid, and in doing so, turned the audience's attention away from personalities and toward principles. "In my life," he said, pausing just long enough to allow each word to land, "I have witnessed every form of injustice. In war zones, in government offices, in quiet corners of American towns. I've seen cruelty committed in the name of law. I've seen indifference dressed up as neutrality. And yes, I have felt the sting of being disrespected, not because of my actions, but because of what I look like." He took a breath. His tone never wavered, not once. "But what I've learned," he said, "is that anger is not the strongest weapon we have. Calmness is. Anger ignites quickly. It burns hot and fast. But calmness, the kind that comes from deep conviction and a sense of purpose, that can sustain a fire long enough to change even the coldest system." He recounted moments in his career, not to boast, but to demonstrate. He told of times when colleagues had dismissed him, when higher-ups had silenced his ideas, when communities had judged him before hearing him. And yet, he said, those were not the moments that defined him. "It wasn't the injustice that shaped me. It was how I responded to it. I am not someone who doesn't feel anger," he said clearly. "I'm human, and sometimes the things I've seen would make anyone want to scream. But I've also learned this. If I let anger lead me, I lose my clarity. I lose the goal. That goal," he emphasized, "was never revenge, never retribution. It was change, not of a single person, but of the very framework that allowed that person to abuse power without consequence. If we respond to hate with hate, to injustice with injustice, then we have already conceded defeat." Applause began slowly, hesitantly, as if the crowd wasn't sure if clapping was appropriate in such solemn clarity. But Hayes didn't wait for validation. He pressed on. "Dignity is not something anyone can give you, and more importantly, it is not something anyone can take from you. They can insult you. They can try to humiliate you. They can question your worth. But you decide whether to accept that narrative. You decide whether to stand straight or to let them bend you." There was something powerful in his stillness. He wasn't rallying them. He was holding up a mirror. Justice is not fueled by rage. It is powered by resolve, by strategy, by relentless, disciplined effort. And it starts not in courts or Congress, but in how each of us chooses to walk through the world. "I never set out to be anyone's symbol," he said softly. "I just tried to do the right thing, one conversation at a time, one conversation at a time." He admitted that change would take decades, that setbacks would come, that progress might look invisible until suddenly it wasn't. But every seed matters. Every quiet decision to hold your head high, every refusal to answer cruelty with cruelty, every young person who chooses discipline over chaos, strategy over fury. That's a building block. And then without warning, he concluded, "Justice is not an explosive burst of anger. Justice is a slow, persistent flame, burning patiently and steadily until the whole world feels its heat." And then he stepped away from the microphone. No music played. No slogans were chanted. The room did not erupt in frenzy. Instead, everyone stood, slowly, in unison, and clapped. It was not the applause of celebrity. It was the recognition of truth. Some wept, others bowed their heads, but all felt the same thing. They had not merely heard a speech. They had been entrusted with a duty. That day, General Hayes did not reclaim honor. He redefined it, and in doing so, he reminded a generation that the true path forward is not paved in rage, but in calm, principled perseverance. After General Hayes's speech, calm, firm, not a single word wasted, the whole of Schley County sank into a strange silence. It wasn't apathy, nor was it shock. It was the silence of a community being forced to confront itself. TVs in barber shops, cafes, convenience stores replayed the video, and everywhere eyes fixed on the screen. No longer burned with simple outrage, they reflected self-examination. The small town, long accustomed to its slow, quiet rhythm, now witnessed something unprecedented. The system they had once trusted, defended, and avoided questioning was being laid bare, piece by piece. No one could claim anymore that it was just an isolated incident. No words could soften the pain of seeing a man with all the character and accomplishments one could ask for, still treated as a threat solely because of the color of his skin. What happened to Carlton D. Hayes wasn't a moment of poor judgment from one bad officer, as some had tried to argue. It was the undeniable, visible manifestation of a system distorted by bias, not overt, but always present, and that forced the community to face a deeply uncomfortable question. How long have we been silent, from churches to schools, from after-work conversations to small online groups? People began to talk about what they had long avoided, racism, not in the form of abstract slogans, but through real experiences, long-buried memories. A high school teacher recalled the time her son was pulled over for no reason after school. A black plumber spoke of the time he was suspected of stealing just for walking into a convenience store. It all broke open like a dam held too long. Within 2 weeks, the wave of public reaction surged, not only from local residents, but from civil rights organizations, journalists, and even former members of law enforcement. National media began reporting on Schley County as a symbol of a trust crisis. Nobody wanted this, but no one could ignore it anymore. The authorities understood that if they failed to act, they wouldn't just lose the people, they'd lose all credibility. Then, during a press conference broadcast across the state of Georgia, held in the county government's main hall, Sheriff Harold Nix stepped up to the podium. No flashy backdrop, no image-polishing banners, just a single mic at center stage and dozens of cameras. His face showed clear fatigue, but his eyes held a rare determination. He didn't evade, he didn't deflect, and that gave weight to every word he said. "We admit," Nix said, "that our system has flaws. No one can deny that, and it is our responsibility to fix them. No blaming a few bad apples, no denial of reality." That opening line earned some goodwill in the community, even if the wound was far from healed. After the bold and candid statement from Sheriff Harold Nix, the people of Schley County didn't have to wait long to see whether actions would follow words. Within less than 48 hours, detailed action plans were publicly posted on the county government website and sent to media outlets across Georgia. Gone were the vague statements, internal memos, or symbolic commitments. This time, the Schley law enforcement system had to bear itself to the light of public scrutiny. The reform plan spanned over 40 pages, with 5 key points highlighted at the beginning, marking a clear shift from reactive compliance to proactive restructuring. First, a mandatory anti-racial bias training program was rolled out for all law enforcement personnel. No office exemptions, no executive immunity. Anyone wearing a badge or authorized to use force had to fully participate. Second, annual training with formal assessments was instituted, not just clocking hours. Each session ended with a comprehension test and an open discussion among officers, requiring them to confront their own unconscious biases. Third, the program would be designed and taught by external experts, including psychologists, university professors, and civil rights veterans, to eliminate the ineffective practice of internal self-regulation. Fourth, an independent community oversight council was established, including civil rights group representatives, local residents, and legal scholars. This council had the authority to access internal complaints, request independent investigations, and recommend disciplinary action. Finally, a transparency commitment. Schley County Police Department would release quarterly public reports on arrests, stops, and use of force incidents, clearly broken down by race, gender, and geographic area. The urgency and assertiveness of the plan caught many by surprise, yet it sparked a positive ripple effect throughout the community. Less than 30 days after the historic press conference, the first training sessions were held in the Old Town Courthouse, once a symbol of white authority, now repurposed as a space for learning and dialogue. The long wooden benches that once separated white and black seating were now aligned equally. No one stood at a podium wagging a finger. Instead, officers engaged in scenario simulations, anonymous group discussions, and raw, emotional conversations. "We don't just teach them not to discriminate," said one trainer, a former civil rights activist. "We force them to flip their own lens, to see a black person pulled over not with suspicion, but as a citizen who deserves service." In one session, a white officer admitted, "I used to think I wasn't prejudiced, but watching footage of myself during a traffic stop, I saw my hand go to my gun, just because the driver was a person of color." Such admissions weren't mocked, they were encouraged. Because as Nix put it, change can't happen if people are too busy pretending there's nothing wrong. Still, not everyone embraced the shift. Some veteran officers filed for early retirement, and a few even accused the department of becoming politicized. An anonymous group went so far as to send threats to members of the Community Oversight Council. But this time, silence didn't return. Sheriff Nix appeared before cameras, voice calm but firm. "If you think questioning bias is an attack on professional honor, then maybe you shouldn't be wearing Schley County's badge." That statement was clipped and widely shared on social media, hailed by both young people and the press as a defining moment, a moral line drawn in the sand. Notably, it was the younger officers, those who had quietly worked within the old system, who became the engine of change. They spoke at internal conferences, initiated community dialogues, and even served as bridges between police and civil rights activists. They didn't deny the past, but refused to let it shackle the future. "I want my daughter to grow up believing in the police, not fearing us," one young officer said at a public forum. The entire room stood to applaud. Media coverage began to shift, too. Instead of feeding on conflict, outlets focused on stories of growth. Morning broadcasts no longer led with arrest statistics alone, but also showed officers visiting schools, speaking with students about justice and the law. Formerly silent officers started blogging, sharing personal journeys of dismantling bias from within. But Nix held no illusions. "We've only laid the first brick," he said in an internal meeting. "The wall between law enforcement and the community wasn't built in a day, and it won't come down with a few press conferences. But at least we've started. And this time, we know the whole country is watching every step we take." For people like General Hayes, a man who chose dignity over revenge, who stayed composed when he had every reason to be enraged, these changes were the clearest proof of the power of calm resolve, of character, and of unshakable belief in justice. He didn't need to retaliate, because the system finally was being forced to reckon with itself. Schley County is no longer a forgotten dot on the map of the American South. It has become a symbol of what many other places need to learn: the courage to admit wrongs, the will to walk out of the shadows, and most of all, the strength to start over. The media storm eventually passed, but its aftershocks continued to reverberate through Schley County and far beyond, across the United States. The incident involving General Carlton Hayes and Officer Karen Wilburn was no longer on front pages, and the related investigations had gradually faded into brief news segments. Yet in the minds of millions, especially those who had witnessed, debated, wept, and raged, it remained an indelible milestone, a scar etched into the collective consciousness about justice, power, and human dignity. Many expected General Hayes to seize the moment, to become a prominent voice in the media, perhaps even step into politics. Television networks offered exclusive deals. Civil rights groups urged him to become a figurehead for reform. Some believed he should speak before Congress, become the face of a national education campaign. But Hayes declined it all. He had no need for the spotlight and even less desire to become a symbol defined by a moment of confrontation. To him, that incident was not a victory, it was a reckoning for the system, for society, and for himself, a lesson that should not be distorted into sensationalism or weaponized for political gain. He wasn't angry, but he hadn't forgotten. He wasn't pessimistic, but he harbored no illusion. In the days that followed, people often saw him arriving at work on time as always, entering the military training facility with the same composed, meticulous demeanor. No grand speeches, no gestures seeking sympathy. He didn't write a memoir, didn't launch a podcast. When asked how he felt after the incident, he answered simply, "I still have work to do." And indeed, he worked tirelessly, but not for himself. For the younger generation, the new recruits, donning uniforms for the first time, the young officers learning how to lead, how to stay grounded under pressure, how to uphold principles amid the seductions of power. To them, Hayes was more than a high-ranking commander. He was a living embodiment of the discipline and integrity that anyone serving the public should carry deep within. He didn't teach with grandiose words. Instead, he used scenarios, examples, and stories where kindness wasn't weakness, but real strength, where patience wasn't submission, but a deliberate, courageous choice. Though he avoided big public platforms, he occasionally accepted invitations to speak at internal military gatherings or officer training seminars. In such settings, he said little, but each word lingered. When asked how he remained calm while being publicly disrespected, he simply replied, "If I lose my composure, I've let them define me by their behavior." That line has since been quoted in classrooms, articles, and social media posts by young people. It resonated because it wasn't hollow. It came from lived experience and from a real human being. Throughout that time, General Hayes launched no reform movements, yet his quiet presence inspired more than any slogan could. His calm resolve was a reminder that not all change needs to be loud. Some truths are best sown deep into thoughtful reflection, deliberate action, personal pride, and professional ethics. The place he chose to plant the seeds of reform was not in congressional halls or national broadcasts, but in the military training grounds. There, he believed that one officer of strong character could ripple more change than any public plea. Because real change doesn't come from a shock, it comes from patient, persistent education. Still wearing his crisp uniform and carrying that familiar calm, General Hayes continued his service within the defense system, quietly working, mentoring the next generation in leadership, discipline, and dignity. To him, what mattered most wasn't the attention following the incident, but ensuring the right values were instilled in those who would shape the future. And in the community, in the hearts of young people who had witnessed the story, the seed of awakening had already begun to grow. Across high schools in Schley County, something unprecedented began to take shape in sociology, law, and civics classrooms. Topics once considered too sensitive, injustice, racism, abuse of power, were no longer avoided. They were now built directly into lesson plans, seen as essential components of modern civic education. Teachers stopped dodging hard conversations. Students stopped holding back. In these discussion periods, students were encouraged for the first time to speak their minds. Kids who had grown up seeing the police as untouchable symbols of order and safety were now re-examining that belief. They weren't taught blind rebellion, but neither were they expected to trust blindly. Above all, they were learning something long ignored: the right to question. What is true justice? What happens when power is misused? How does a person keep their dignity when facing injustice? These weren't abstract questions. They were anchored to a real face, a real story. General Carlton Hayes, his image standing tall in the courtroom, enduring insults without retaliating in anger, his refusal to wield his own power for revenge, choosing instead a silence full of gravity, his quiet return to work, rather than stepping into media spotlights. These things had become a deeper lesson than any textbook could offer. To students in Schley, Hayes was no longer just a general. He was proof that dignity could endure even in the heart of a storm, that you didn't need to raise your voice to be heard, that you didn't need revenge to win. In their eyes, he became living evidence that one could stand against a flawed system without letting it deform their humanity. At a small seminar in the Schley High School auditorium, during a discussion titled Justice and the System, an 11th grade student stood up, eyes wide with both innocence and challenge, and asked the teacher, "Can we actually change the system? Or is justice just a beautiful dream?" No one answered right away, but the question didn't vanish. It echoed through student forums, resonated in college debate clubs, surfaced in scholarship essays, and even sparked conversations at dinner tables. A new generation was forming, not naive enough to believe the system was perfect, but not yet bitter enough to give up on changing it. And it was in those scattered, imperfect conversations that Hayes's legacy became clearest. He never stepped into classrooms, never entered political arenas, never engaged in public debate, and yet what he left behind traveled farther than any speech. He didn't raise his voice, but he became the loudest voice in the room. His story of unshaken composure in the face of cruelty began making its way into university courses on leadership, public administration, and ethics. No one referred to him as a victim of injustice anymore. They called him what he had become, a symbol of inner strength, of quiet integrity, of a rare kind of ethical leadership. The reform didn't come in waves or loud protest marches, but beneath the surface, it began to seep in. Police academies across Georgia and beyond started offering new courses: ethical leadership, public accountability, the psychology of power. Instructors were no longer only retired officers. They now included sociologists, ethicists, and those who had once faced the justice system from the other side. The message running through these programs was unmistakable. Power is not a privilege. It is a responsibility, and without self-awareness and moral grounding, it becomes a double-edged blade, capable of inflicting irreversible damage. Some critics called these reforms too small, too slow, but Hayes once told a room full of young officers in a closed leadership session, "Justice is not a lightning strike. It's the echo of steady footsteps." He knew it would be a long time before society reached the fairness many dream of, but he believed every seed planted, every question asked, every young person bold enough to challenge indifference was part of justice being quietly built. The story of General Hayes is more than just a dramatic confrontation or a case of injustice reversed. It is a powerful social mirror, forcing us to reflect on how often we judge others based on skin color, uniform, appearance, or silent assumptions. When a decorated military officer is humiliated and handcuffed on the roadside, not for any wrongdoing, but simply because of the color of his skin, we are forced to confront the painful truth. Our society still sees through lenses of prejudice. But what makes this story remarkable is not only what happened to Hayes, but how he responded. He did not shout. He did not retaliate with anger. Instead, he stood calm, with dignity, embodying a rare kind of power, one that does not need to roar to be felt. His composure shattered the illusion of superiority that had been wielded against him like a weapon. That is the first and perhaps most vital lesson. Do not rush to judge others based on bias. When we rely on appearance, assumption, or stereotype to shape our judgments, we not only hurt others, we blind ourselves to truth. The officer did not see a general who had led troops and shaped national defense strategy. He saw a black man alone and assumed guilt. That moment revealed how prejudice disables our ability to see clearly. The second lesson is equally important. Never underestimate the value or potential of another human being. True strength is not loud. It is not always visible. It does not always come with medals or titles. Sometimes it walks quietly, with purpose, grounded in wisdom. General Hayes reminded us that even when the world does not recognize your worth, your inner resolve can speak louder than any external validation. This story calls to mind all those in history who were dismissed before they rose to transform the world. Rosa Parks was a seamstress, Mandela a prisoner, Malala a schoolgirl, and yet they carried revolutions on their shoulders. How many great minds, talents, or leaders are still overlooked today because we refuse to see past surface impressions? How many times have we missed the truth because it did not come dressed in what we expected? Hayes didn't demand recognition. He didn't need to prove himself. His calm response was itself a protest, one that said, "I know who I am, and that's enough." But this story does not end with vindication. It rippled far beyond that road sign. When the truth came out and the world saw what had happened, people began asking deeper questions, not just about that one officer, but about the system that empowered such behavior. Students debated justice in classrooms. Teachers, once hesitant, now engaged boldly with tough conversations. The public no longer stayed silent. That leads us to the final and perhaps most hopeful message of all. Justice always finds a way to prevail. Even when the road is long and unfairness feels overwhelming, truth has a way of rising, especially when we stand with courage and perseverance. Hayes didn't just defend himself. He became a symbol. His silence under pressure spoke volume. His poise in the face of disrespect reminded us that real change does not always come through shouting, but sometimes through simply refusing to stoop to hate. And that's where the true power of his story lies, not in military rank, but in moral strength. So, ask yourself, have you ever been misjudged because someone didn't understand you? Because you didn't look like what they expected? Have you ever been underestimated, only to quietly prove them wrong? If you have, then you understand what Hayes carried that day. You understand the weight of being seen as less and the quiet fire it ignites to rise higher. This story is not just about Hayes. It's about all of us. It's a call to see people more clearly, to treat others with respect, and to listen before we judge. It is a reminder to walk through the world with open hearts and open minds. And above all, it is a message to those who feel unseen. You are more powerful than they know. Don't let their blindness define your journey. Let your actions speak. Let your dignity shine. And let your story inspire others who are still waiting to be seen. If this story made you reflect, please share it so that more people can hear its message, learn from its lessons, and help reshape a society where no one is ever dismissed because of how they look. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more real-life stories that challenge prejudice, celebrate quiet strength, and remind us all justice is not just an ideal, it's a responsibility we all carry.